The doctor said I was clinically dead for almost 8 minutes. But during those 8 minutes, something happened that changed me forever. I encountered Jesus Christ, and he showed me a vision of what's coming after March 30th, 2025. Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm 42 years old, a high school English teacher from a small town in Georgia. And this is the story of how I died, what I saw on the other side, and the urgent message I was sent back to share with you. I was always the practical one, the rational thinker. Sure, I went to church every Sunday, taught Sunday school, and volunteered at every community event. My faith was something I wore proudly, but looking back now, I realize it was more like a comfortable sweater than the fire it should have been. My life changed forever 3 months ago, but to understand what happened, you need to know a bit about me first. I lost my husband James to a heart attack 5 years ago. It was sudden. 1 minute we were planning our summer vacation. The next I was planning his funeral. I prayed harder than I'd ever prayed in my life. I begged God on my knees to save him, to perform a miracle. But James was gone. I never said it out loud, but inside I was angry. I'd done everything right. I'd been faithful. I'd served. Why didn't God answer my prayers? I buried that bitterness deep down and kept showing up to church with a smile, but something had fractured inside me. The only bright spot in my life was my daughter Emma. She graduated college last year and moved to Seattle for a job in tech. She's brilliant, always was, but somewhere along the way, she left her faith behind. Our phone calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, any mention of God or church would make her voice go cold. I remember last Thanksgiving, sitting at our 2 empty table. Emma looked up from her plate and said, "Mom, you know I respect you, but I don't need God to figure out my life. I've got it handled. I couldn't control myself. You think you've got it all figured out? You're walking away from everything we raised you to believe." I slammed my hand on the table, making the glasses jump. Emma didn't yell back. She just looked at me with this sad, distant expression that hurt worse than any argument. "This is why I don't come home more often," she said quietly. Then she got up, grabbed her coat, and left. She slept at a hotel that night and flew back to Seattle the next morning. I sat alone in my kitchen that night, staring at the cross hanging on my wall, feeling utterly helpless. I prayed for guidance, for some way to reach my daughter. I had no idea that God's answer would come in a way I could never have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in December. Nothing special about it. I woke up at 5:30 like I always do, made my coffee, sat in the old rocking chair that James and I bought at an antique store when we first got married. I did my morning devotional, though, if I'm being honest, I was just going through the motions. "Lord," I whispered, "guide me today. Keep me safe. Help me live according to your will." Simple words I'd said thousands of times before. I had no idea they would be the last prayer I'd say as a living person. After breakfast, I grabbed my tote bag full of essays to grade and headed out to my car. It was one of those damp, gray winter mornings in Georgia, not cold enough for snow, but chilly enough that the dampness seeps into your bones. The roads were slick from an overnight drizzle. I was on my way to school, driving the same route I'd taken for 15 years. The traffic was heavier than usual. I remember reaching to turn up the heat, thinking about the faculty meeting scheduled for that afternoon. Such an ordinary moment. Then it happened. There was a logging truck coming the other way. Later, they told me the driver had fallen asleep. His truck crossed the median and came straight at me. I remember the blinding headlights cutting through the morning mist, the deafening blare of the horn. There was absolutely nowhere for me to go. The impact was like nothing I can describe. Metal screaming against metal. The world spinning as my car flipped. Glass exploding around me. A sharp, burning pain radiating through my entire body. And yet, in that moment of pure chaos, the strangest feeling of calm came over me. As my car rolled and my body broke, a single thought filled my mind. "Jesus, I trust you." Then darkness. The next thing I remember is the weightlessness. That's the only way I can describe it, like gravity had suddenly forgotten about me. I felt no pain, no pressure, nothing holding me down. I opened my eyes, or at least it felt like I did, and saw myself on a stretcher. My clothes were soaked in blood. My blouse had been cut open, revealing terrible bruises across my chest. There was a gash on my forehead that didn't even look real, like something from a movie. Doctors and nurses surrounded me, working frantically. One doctor was doing chest compressions, pushing down on my body with both hands. "We're losing her," he said to a nurse. "Push one more of AP." I watched the monitor beside my body flatline, that terrible monotone beep stretching into one continuous sound. I was dead. I knew it with absolute certainty. Yet somehow I was still aware, still thinking, still me. Before I could process what was happening, I felt myself being pulled away. The hospital scene receded and I was plunged into darkness. Not just darkness like a night without stars, but a living darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. I was moving fast through this void, like being swept away by an invisible current. Cold whispers brushed against me, and fear unlike anything I'd ever known gripped me. "God!" I tried to scream, but no sound came out. "Where are you? I've believed in you my whole life. I've trusted you. Was this death? This terrible darkness? Had all my faith been for nothing?" Just as despair threatened to consume me, I saw it, a pinpoint of light in the distance. Tiny at first, then growing, spreading, until it radiated outward like the sun breaking through clouds. When that light touched me, everything changed. The fear dissolved. The cold vanished. I felt embraced by a love so pure, so complete that it defies description. This wasn't just the absence of fear, it was perfect love, perfect peace. And then I heard something, not from the light, but from somewhere far behind me. It was a woman's voice, soft but determined. "Please, God, save her." It was one of the nurses, praying over my broken body in the trauma room. In that moment, I realized that God wasn't just with me in this light. He was also with those struggling to save me back on earth. His presence was everywhere, in ways I'd never fully understood. Then he appeared. I knew immediately it was Jesus. Not because he looked like the paintings or the movies, but because every cell of my being recognized him. He wore white, and light seemed to emanate from within him rather than shine upon him. His hands bore the scars of crucifixion, marks I'd heard about all my life, but never truly comprehended until I saw them. But it was his eyes that struck me most deeply. They weren't just looking at me. They were seeing through me, into me, knowing every thought I'd ever had, every word I'd ever spoken, every action I'd ever taken. Nothing was hidden. I wanted to look away, to shield myself from that all-knowing gaze, but I couldn't. Then he spoke. "Sarah." His voice was gentle yet penetrating, like thunder that doesn't frighten but commands attention. "You have spoken of faith every day, but do you live by it?" I tried to answer, but the words wouldn't come, because I knew the truth. I had prayed daily, attended church faithfully, taught others about God. But had I truly lived as though I believed? How many times had I hesitated to speak about my faith at work? How often had I chosen comfort over conviction? How frequently had my actions contradicted my words? Tears streamed down my face. "Lord, forgive me," I whispered. Jesus didn't respond immediately. He let me sit with my recognition, my regret. But then he placed his hand on my shoulder and warmth spread through me. "True faith is a fire, not ashes," he said. "I don't need empty prayers. I need hearts ready to act." His words pierced me like a blade. I realized that my faith had become routine, ritual, habit, not the living, breathing force it was meant to be. I had been going through the motions while my heart grew cold. I can't continue like this, I thought. Not anymore. Jesus led me through what felt like a dense fog, and suddenly we were standing before what looked like a vast screen. On it, I saw scenes unlike anything I could have imagined. I saw churches with padlocked doors. The crosses that once adorned their steeples had been removed. Signs posted outside read, "Repurposed for community wellness and modernized for social cohesion." People who still believed gathered in small apartments, their curtains drawn tight, voices hushed as they read from worn Bibles. They exchanged nervous glances at every sound from the street below. On a news broadcast, a polished anchor announced, "The Unified Discourse Act has been passed by an overwhelming majority." Speech deemed divisive or promoting outdated ideological frameworks will no longer be tolerated in public spaces. I saw a gentle-faced man reading aloud from the Bible in a park. He wasn't shouting or condemning anyone, just reading peacefully. Within minutes, officers approached, confiscated his Bible, and led him away in handcuffs as onlookers recorded with their phones. Religious expression is still protected, another news report claimed, provided it aligns with contemporary community standards. Families were torn apart by these new realities. A father cleared out his desk after being terminated for refusing to attend perspective alignment training. A mother wept as she received notice of a custody hearing. Her ex-husband claimed she was indoctrinating their children with religious teachings. A teenage boy sat alone at lunch while classmates mockingly called him Bible freak and religious extremist. Religious leaders stood at pulpits, but their messages had changed. No mention of sin, repentance, or absolute truth. They spoke of a God who never judges, never expects change, never makes demands, a deity reshaped to fit the sensibilities of the age. My heart ached as I watched. Lord, I asked, is this what's coming? His eyes were sorrowful but unsurprised. My people have been warned, but they do not listen. Now is the time when each must decide who will stand firm and who will compromise. The next image that appeared was the most disturbing of all. It was me, but not as I was now. This was a future version of myself, standing before what looked like a community review board. Their faces were stern, their voices cold. Miss Sarah Taylor once said, reading from a tablet, "You've been cited for promoting divisive ideology that undermines community harmony. Are you willing to acknowledge that your religious views should be kept private and not expressed in ways that might influence others?" I watched myself standing there, trembling but steady. "I have only one God," my future self said clearly. "I cannot deny him." Murmurs rippled through the room. A woman stepped forward, her tone reasonable, persuasive. "Sarah, no one is asking you to abandon your personal beliefs. We're simply asking you to keep them private. Believe what you want in your heart, but don't share it publicly." Is that really so much to ask? I understood then. This wasn't about banning faith outright. It was about silencing it, confining it, neutering it until it became a private eccentricity rather than a living truth. The scene shifted, and I saw Emma, my daughter. She sat in a trendy cafe with colleagues, all of them laughing. One of them was imitating someone praying, hands clasped in exaggerated piety. "Your mom is still super religious, right?" someone asked Emma. She forced a smile and shrugged. "She's old-fashioned." More laughter. Emma joined in, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't mocking me out of malice. She was trying to belong, to avoid becoming the target herself. "Lord," I cried, tears streaming down my face, even my own daughter. Jesus placed his hand on my shoulder, his gaze both solemn and compassionate. This is not the end, but a challenge. Those who stand firm become beacons in the darkness. Looking back at the image of Emma, I realized something. There was more to this story. One day, she would remember me not as an embarrassment, but as someone who refused to compromise. Whether she understood it now or not, my steadfastness would plant a seed. Hope surged within me. Even amid rejection, misunderstanding, and loss, the light would never be completely extinguished. Suddenly, the scene around me shifted again. I found myself standing in a dusty landscape dotted with ancient buildings. In the center of what looked like a stone pit, a man knelt in prayer, his head bowed, hands folded. From the shadows, lions emerged, massive, hungry beasts with gleaming teeth and powerful limbs. They circled the praying man, growling low in their throats. Yet he continued to pray, unmoving. A brilliant light flooded the den, and the lions immediately backed away, crouching like house cats. They told Daniel not to pray, Jesus said beside me. They threatened him, yet he would not bow his head to anyone but God. In the end, who was victorious? The scene changed again. 3 young men stood bound before a blazing furnace, guards pushing them toward the flames. Despite the heat that made even the soldiers shield their faces, the 3 stood resolute. "We will not bow to your idol," one declared. "The God we serve is able to save us from the fire. But even if he does not, we want you to know that we will not serve your gods." They were thrust into the furnace, the flames leaping high. I gasped, expecting to see them consumed, but within the fire walked a fourth figure, majestic and powerful. The flames couldn't touch them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Jesus said. They faced death rather than compromise. Their faith was not mere words. Once more, the scene shifted. This time to a prison cell, dim, but not the dungeon I might have expected. Two men sat against the wall, their backs bloodied from flogging, their ankles in chains. Yet they were singing. Their voices rose in praise, their faces alight with an inner joy that transcended their circumstances. The walls seemed to tremble with the power of their worship. Paul and Silas, Jesus explained, beaten, imprisoned, yet undefeated. This is faith that cannot be chained. I felt his hand on my shoulder again, his eyes gazing deeply into mine. The fire of testing does not destroy true faith, it refines it. He gestured forward, and I saw two paths diverging, one showing those who surrendered their convictions under pressure, and another showing those who stood firm despite the cost. A woman huddled in the rain with a small child pressed to her chest. She had lost everything, home, job, family, because she wouldn't renounce her faith. As she knelt on the wet pavement, praying through tears, a stranger approached. Without a word, he extended his umbrella over her and the child, then offered his hand to help her up. It was a small act, but in that moment it meant everything. Faith endured. Love continued. Even in the darkest times, light found a way to shine. Jesus placed both hands on my shoulders now, his voice resonating with authority and love. Do not be afraid. Remember, I am always with those who remain steadfast. The scene changed once more. This time, I saw believers arguing among themselves, dividing into factions, turning against one another. You're too confrontational, one group accused. You're bringing persecution on all of us, and you're compromising the truth, others fired back. You're trying to make faith palatable to a world that hates God. As they argued, a shadow moved among them, whispering, stoking their fear and resentment. It was working to divide what should have been united. Jesus appeared, his light dispelling the darkness. The enemy doesn't need to defeat you with strength. It only needs to divide you. A lone sheep will be devoured, but a united flock will stand firm. I thought of the early church, believers meeting in catacombs and caves, sharing bread, praying together, supporting one another despite the threat of Roman persecution. Their unity was their strength. Love one another as I have loved you, Jesus said. Unity is your greatest weapon. The light around us intensified until it was almost blinding. I stood before Jesus, his white robe radiant, his eyes penetrating yet filled with love. Warn my people, he said, each word resonating like a bell. I trembled. Lord, what can I do? I'm just one person. My voice is so small. He stepped closer, placing his hand over my heart. Warmth flooded through me like liquid light. Faith is not just words, but action, he said. I don't need those who only pray behind closed doors. I need those who will stand up and be counted. His voice grew more intense, yet remained gentle. I am giving you a second chance, Sarah, but you must carry this flame. The flame, I understood. Not just to keep it safe, but to spread it, to ignite others, to ensure that when the darkness came, the light would still burn. Before I could respond, a powerful force pulled me backward. The light receded, like curtains closing on the most important scene of my life. I tried to hold on, to stay in that holy presence, but I couldn't. I plunged back into darkness, but this time it was different, more a void than a presence. Heavy, crushing. My body felt leaden, every limb weighted as if with stone. Slowly, painfully, I opened my eyes. Harsh fluorescent lights stabbed at my vision. Beeping machines. The antiseptic smell of hospital. The plastic oxygen mask over my face. I was back. A nurse standing beside my bed gasped, her clipboard clattering to the floor. Doctor, she shouted, her voice shaking. Doctor, she's awake. A flurry of activity followed. Doctors rushing in, checking vitals, shining lights in my eyes, asking questions I couldn't yet answer. Ms. Taylor, the lead doctor said, leaning over me with amazement in his eyes, you were gone for nearly 8 minutes. We did everything we could. But honestly, this is nothing short of miraculous. 8 minutes. It had felt like lifetimes. I knew then that I hadn't just been spared by random chance. I'd been sent back with a purpose, a mission I couldn't ignore. 6 weeks later, after surgeries and physical therapy, I returned to my church. It was a Sunday morning, the sanctuary filled with familiar faces, good people who had visited me in the hospital, brought meals during my recovery, prayed for my healing. But today, I wasn't there just to worship. I was there to speak truth. With permission from my pastor, I stood at the podium, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. I shared everything: the accident, my death, meeting Jesus, the visions of what was coming, and his urgent message for believers. As I spoke, I watched their reactions. Some leaned forward, eyes wide. Others shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged skeptical glances. When I finished, there was silence. Then a man in the back row stood up. "Sarah," he said kindly, "we're all glad you're recovering, but what you're describing sounds like hallucinations from oxygen deprivation. The brain does strange things when it's traumatized." Several people nodded. Someone else added, "Near-death experiences are well-documented psychological phenomena." I felt a wall forming between us, not of hostility, but of polite disbelief. They were the same people, but I was no longer the same Sarah they had known. In their eyes, I had become someone different, someone making claims they couldn't accept. That evening, my doorbell rang. It was Emma. She had flown in from Seattle after hearing about my accident, but this was her first visit since I'd been released from the hospital. "So," she said, settling awkwardly on the edge of the sofa, "you're having visions now? Mom, the doctor said your brain was without oxygen for minutes. Don't you think that's the more likely explanation?" Her voice was gentle but edged with concern, the kind reserved for someone who might be losing touch with reality. I looked at my daughter, so smart, so capable, so certain she understood how the world worked. I didn't argue or try to convince her. I just smiled. "You don't have to believe me right now," I said softly. "I just hope you'll listen." Emma stayed for dinner. She didn't say much, but I caught her watching me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. She saw that I was different, calmer, more certain, somehow changed at a fundamental level. After Emma left, I knew I couldn't wait for others to understand. I had to act on what I'd been shown. I began simply. Instead of just attending church, I started volunteering at our local homeless shelter. I visited nursing homes. I spoke about my faith openly at school, not preaching, but no longer hiding who I was or what I believed. Some parents complained. The principal called me in for a friendly chat about maintaining appropriate boundaries. I was polite but firm. My faith wasn't something I could check at the door like a coat. I organized small gatherings, not in church buildings, but in homes, parks, coffee shops. We studied scripture, but more importantly, we talked about how to live it out. How to stand firm when pressure came. How to love those who opposed us. How to prepare for difficult days ahead. Prayer without action is a dead faith, I told them. We need to be flames, not ashes. We can't hide behind these walls and wait for a miracle. God isn't calling fearful sheep. He's calling warriors of light. At first, only a handful came. An elderly woman who began bringing meals to homeless veterans. A teenage boy who stood up against bullying at his school. A businessman who started mentoring young men from broken homes. Small actions, but powerful ones. Seeds planted in fertile soil. Word spread. More people joined our gatherings. Not powerful leaders or theological scholars, just ordinary people who wanted their faith to mean something real. And then one evening, as we were meeting in my living room, the front door opened quietly. Emma stood there, hesitating at the threshold. She didn't say anything, didn't join the discussion. She just sat in the back, listening. I didn't make a big deal of it. I didn't rush over to hug her or point out her presence to the others. I just kept speaking, and in my heart I knew the seed had been planted. My story isn't over. In many ways, it's just beginning. I don't know exactly what the future holds, or when the things I saw will come to pass. But I know this. I was given a second chance for a reason. I died, and in those moments between worlds, Jesus showed me what's coming. Now I'm sharing it with you. Not to frighten you, but to prepare you. Not to make you retreat from the world, but to help you engage with it more boldly, more authentically, more faithfully than ever before.